The summer of 2013 had been particularly scorching in West Texas, where the endless stretches of highway cut through the rugged landscape like scars across weathered leather. San Angelo, with its oil rigs dotting the horizon and cattle ranches spreading as far as the eye could see, was home to 26-year-old Brandon Lawson, a man who worked hard with his hands and loved deeply with his heart. He shared a modest home with Lawson, his girlfriend of 10 years, and their 4 children, building what seemed like a stable life, despite the challenges that came with raising a family in a town where opportunities were scarce and the heat was relentless. On the evening of August 8th, the air conditioning units throughout San Angelo hummed desperately against another day that had soared well above 100 degrees. The smell of sage and mesquite hung heavy in the air, mixed with the distant aroma of barbecue smoke drifting from backyard gatherings. Brandon had been working construction jobs around town, his calloused hands and sun-darkened face testament to long days under the punishing Texas sun. But lately, something had been eating at him, a restlessness that Ledessa could sense even when he tried to hide it behind his warm smile and easy laugh. Before we dive deeper into this mystery that would haunt a family for over 11 years, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing you these important stories about missing people who deserve to be remembered. That Thursday evening started like so many others in their small house on the outskirts of San Angelo. The children were settling down for the night, their laughter echoing through the hallways as Ledessa tried to corral them into their bedrooms. Brandon had been quieter than usual, staring out the window toward the endless expanse of Highway 277 that stretched north toward his father's house in Crowley, a 3-hour drive through some of the most desolate country in Texas. The relationship between Brandon and Ledessa had weathered many storms over their decade together, including Brandon's struggles with substance abuse, though he had been clean for about 6 months and seemed to be turning his life around. But as the clock approached 11 that night, the tension that had been building between them finally erupted. The argument began over something that seemed minor, the kind of disagreement that couples have after long days and short tempers, but it quickly escalated into something much more serious. Ledessa had noticed that Brandon hadn't come home the previous night, and her suspicions about his recent behavior came pouring out. She accused him of using drugs again, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear as she watched the man she loved potentially slipping back into old patterns. Brandon denied her accusations vehemently, his own voice rising as he felt cornered and misunderstood. The house that had been filled with children's laughter just hours before now echoed with harsh words and raised voices. Neighbors later recalled hearing the argument through the thin walls, the sound of doors slamming and feet pacing across creaky floorboards. For Brandon, who had been working so hard to rebuild his life and prove himself as a father and partner, Ledessa's accusations felt like a betrayal of the progress he believed he had made. The weight of his past mistakes, the addiction that had nearly destroyed everything he cared about, pressed down on him like the oppressive Texas heat. As the argument reached its peak around 10:45, Brandon made a decision that would change everything. Instead of staying to work through their problems, instead of sleeping on the couch and talking things out in the morning, he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. The silver Ford F-150 pickup truck sitting in their driveway represented escape, a way to put distance between himself and the confrontation that was tearing at his heart. Ledessa watched from the window as he climbed into the cab, the interior light briefly illuminating his face, etched with frustration and hurt. Before starting the engine, Brandon pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. His father answered on the 3rd ring, the older man's voice groggy with sleep, but immediately alert when he heard his son's voice. Brandon's words were measured but heavy with emotion as he explained that he needed to get away for a while, that things with Ledessa had gotten heated and he needed time to think. He told his father he was driving to Crowley, that 3-hour journey north through the heart of Texas oil country, and that he would be there sometime in the early morning hours. At exactly 11:54 that night, Brandon backed out of the driveway and began what would become one of the most mysterious disappearances in Texas history. The truck's headlights swept across the quiet residential street before turning toward Highway 277, that long ribbon of asphalt that connected small Texas towns like beads on a string. As he drove through the sleeping city of San Angelo, past the closed gas stations and empty parking lots, Brandon could not have known that he was beginning a journey that would end not at his father's house, but somewhere in the darkness between San Angelo and Bronte, in a place where his voice would be heard one last time on a desperate 911 call before vanishing forever. The road north from San Angelo toward Bronte stretched through some of the most isolated country in West Texas, where cell phone towers were few and far between, and the nearest town might be 20 miles away. As Brandon drove through the night, his silver Ford F-150 became a small beacon of light, moving through an ocean of darkness, carrying with it all of his hopes for reconciliation with Ledessa, his dreams for his children's future, and his determination to prove that he was a man worthy of their love and trust. But somewhere in that vast expanse of Texas highway, something went terribly wrong. The gas gauge that Brandon might not have been watching carefully in his emotional state began its steady descent toward empty. The truck that had carried him away from his troubles was about to become the centerpiece of a mystery that would consume his family's lives and capture the attention of amateur investigators across the country. In just a few hours, that silver F-150 would be found abandoned on the shoulder of Highway 277, its owner nowhere to be found, leaving behind only questions that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The stretch of Highway 277 between San Angelo and Bronte was particularly unforgiving on that August night in 2013. The 2-lane road wound through cattle ranches and oil fields, past pump jacks that nodded rhythmically in the darkness like mechanical prayers. There were no streetlights for miles, no 24-hour convenience stores or rest stops where a stranded motorist might find help. The landscape was dotted with mesquite trees and prickly pear cactus, terrain that could easily hide a person or swallow them up entirely in its vastness. As Brandon's fuel gauge approached empty sometime after midnight, he must have felt a growing sense of anxiety. The argument with Ledessa was still fresh in his mind, the harsh words they had exchanged echoing in the silence of the truck cab. His children's faces probably flashed through his thoughts, along with the realization that his impulsive decision to leave might have consequences he hadn't fully considered. The outstanding warrant that hung over his head for a minor offense added another layer of stress to an already difficult situation. At approximately 12:30 in the morning on August 9th, Brandon's worst fears were realized when his truck began to sputter and slow down. The silver F-150 coasted to a stop on the shoulder of Highway 277, about 4 miles south of the tiny town of Bronte, in a location that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. The truck's hazard lights began their rhythmic blinking, casting intermittent red flashes across the empty highway and the surrounding countryside. In the distance, the lights of Bronte flickered like earthbound stars, tantalizingly close but impossibly far for someone stranded without transportation. Brandon's first instinct was to call for help, and he immediately dialed his brother Kyle's number. Kyle Lawson lived in San Angelo and had always been someone Brandon could count on in times of trouble. When Kyle's phone rang in the early morning hours, he answered immediately, recognizing his brother's number and sensing the urgency in the late-night call. Brandon's voice came through the phone connection, strained and worried, as he explained his predicament. He told Kyle that he had run out of gas on Highway 277 and needed help, but there was something else in his voice, an edge of fear that Kyle had never heard before. During that initial phone call, Brandon said something that would haunt his family for years to come. He told Kyle that 3 people were chasing him out of town, using profanity to describe his pursuers, and later clarifying that he was referring to people he called the Mexicans in the neighborhood. Kyle, concerned about his brother's mental state, asked if he was hallucinating, a question that seemed to indicate familiarity with Brandon's past struggles with substance abuse. Brandon emphatically denied that he was seeing things that weren't there, insisting that the danger was real and immediate. Kyle immediately sprang into action, gathering his wife and their 4-year-old child and driving to Ledessa's house to retrieve a gas container. The urgency in Brandon's voice had communicated itself clearly, and Kyle knew that his brother needed help quickly. As he loaded the gas can into his vehicle, Kyle continued to receive phone calls from Brandon. But these conversations became increasingly frustrating and strange. Brandon wouldn't hold a normal conversation, often ending calls after just a few sentences, leaving Kyle with more questions than answers about what was really happening on that dark stretch of highway. The timeline of events that followed would become crucial to understanding Brandon Lawson's disappearance, though many questions about those final hours would remain unanswered for over 11 years. At 12:50 in the morning, just 20 minutes after his initial call to Kyle, Brandon made a decision that suggested his situation had become truly desperate. He dialed 911, a call that would be answered at a local nursing home in Robert Lee, Texas, due to the rural nature of the area and the way emergency services were distributed across the vast West Texas counties. The 911 call that Brandon made would become one of the most analyzed pieces of audio evidence in missing person cases, though much of what he said remained unclear due to poor cell phone reception and his obvious emotional distress. When the operator answered, Brandon immediately stated that he had run out of gas and needed the police to respond to his location. But as the call progressed, his statements became increasingly confused and alarming. He told the operator, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. Push some guys over right here going toward Abilene on both sides." The audio was garbled in places, making it difficult to understand exactly what Brandon was trying to communicate. Even more disturbing was Brandon's next statement during the 911 call. "My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy's chasing me to the woods. Please hurry." These words painted a picture of a man in immediate danger, someone who felt threatened and was possibly being pursued by unknown individuals. When the operator asked if he needed an ambulance, Brandon replied that he needed police, suggesting that he believed his situation was a criminal matter rather than a medical emergency. Several minutes after Brandon's 911 call, at 12:56 in the morning, a truck driver traveling northbound on Highway 277 spotted the silver F-150 parked in what appeared to be a hazardous position on the roadway. The trucker called 911 to report the vehicle, noting that it was positioned over the white line and could pose a danger to other motorists traveling the highway in the darkness. This call would bring law enforcement to the scene, though by the time they arrived, Brandon would already be missing. Between 12:50 and 1:15 in the morning, Brandon's phone continued to ring with calls from Kyle, Ledessa, neighbors, and the 911 dispatcher trying to maintain contact with him. The poor cell phone reception in that remote area caused many of these calls to go directly to voicemail, creating gaps in communication that added to the confusion and urgency of the situation. Those who did manage to connect with Brandon reported that he sounded increasingly distressed and disoriented, his voice carrying notes of panic that grew more pronounced with each conversation. The last confirmed contact with Brandon came at approximately 1:18 in the morning, when Kyle managed to reach him by phone. During this final conversation, Brandon sounded out of breath and told his brother that he was bleeding, a revelation that sent chills down Kyle's spine and added a new dimension of terror to an already frightening situation. The call was brief, and after 1:19 in the morning, all attempts to reach Brandon's phone went straight to voicemail, as if the device had been turned off or had lost power entirely. At around 1:10 in the morning, a Coke County Sheriff's deputy arrived at the location where Brandon's truck had been reported. The silver F-150 was exactly where the trucker had described, sitting on the shoulder of Highway 277 with its hazard lights still blinking. The deputy approached the vehicle cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he examined the truck for any signs of its owner. The gas tank was indeed empty, and there was no visible damage to the vehicle that might suggest an accident or mechanical problem beyond running out of fuel. Kyle arrived at the scene at almost exactly the same time as the deputy, having driven as quickly as safely possible through the dark Texas countryside with a gas can in his vehicle and fear in his heart. The timing of his arrival meant that he was able to speak directly with the responding officer, though he made a decision that he would later regret. Knowing that Brandon had an outstanding warrant and suspecting that his brother might be hiding from law enforcement, Kyle chose not to mention the 911 call that Brandon had made or the strange statements about being chased. In what would become one of the most eerie aspects of the entire case, Kyle received another phone call from Brandon while he was standing next to the abandoned truck, talking to the deputy. Brandon's voice came through the phone clearly, telling Kyle, "I can see you. I'm right here." Kyle immediately began scanning the surrounding area, his eyes straining against the darkness as he searched for any sign of his brother. The deputy also looked around, using his powerful flashlight to illuminate the brush and roadside ditches, but neither man could see Brandon anywhere, despite his claim that he was close enough to observe them. The landscape around the truck was typical of that part of Texas, with rolling hills covered in mesquite and prickly pear, interspersed with areas of open pasture where cattle grazed during the day. There were plenty of places where a person could hide, intentionally or otherwise, and the darkness made visibility extremely limited beyond the range of flashlights. Kyle called out his brother's name repeatedly, his voice echoing across the empty countryside, but received no response other than the sound of wind rustling through the brush and the distant lowing of cattle. After speaking with the deputy and searching the immediate area around the truck, Kyle made another decision that would haunt him for years. He drove a short distance up the road and parked his car, hoping that Brandon would emerge from wherever he was hiding once the law enforcement officer left the scene. Kyle waited in his vehicle for 30 to 45 minutes, the gas can sitting ready in his truck bed, his phone in his hand, as he repeatedly tried to call his brother. The silence that greeted each attempt to make contact grew more ominous with each passing minute. Eventually, Kyle made the difficult decision to leave the scene, placing the gas can in the bed of Brandon's truck so that his brother would be able to refuel and continue his journey if he returned. As Kyle drove away from that lonely stretch of Highway 277, he must have wrestled with doubts about his decision, wondering if he should have stayed longer or insisted that the deputy conduct a more thorough search of the area. The image of Brandon's abandoned truck, its hazard light still blinking in his rearview mirror, would remain burned into his memory forever. Unable to sleep and increasingly worried about his brother's welfare, Kyle returned to the location around 5 in the morning, hoping against hope that he would find Brandon back at his truck, perhaps refueling or waiting for help. Instead, he found the silver F-150 exactly as he had left it, the gas can untouched in the bed, no sign that Brandon had returned during the hours Kyle had been away. The morning sun was beginning to rise over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but bringing no relief to Kyle's growing fear that something terrible had happened to his brother. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, a tow truck arrived to remove Brandon's abandoned vehicle from the roadside. The truck was impounded as part of the initial investigation, though it yielded few clues about what had happened to its owner. Brandon's keys were missing, as was his cell phone, suggesting that he had taken these items with him when he left the vehicle. There were no signs of a struggle inside or around the truck, no blood or other evidence that might indicate violence had occurred at that location. The official search for Brandon Lawson began almost immediately, with local deputies organizing search parties and spending several hours investigating the area near where his truck had been found. Volunteers from the community joined professional searchers as they combed through the brush and ranches surrounding Highway 277, looking for any trace of the missing man. The terrain was challenging, filled with thorny vegetation and hidden ravines where someone could easily become lost or injured, especially in the darkness. Despite the extensive initial search efforts, no signs of Brandon were discovered. No footprints leading away from his truck, no pieces of clothing caught on the ubiquitous mesquite thorns, no indication of which direction he might have traveled after abandoning his vehicle. The complete absence of physical evidence was both puzzling and frustrating to the searchers, who had expected to find at least some trace of Brandon's passage through the area. As news of Brandon's disappearance spread through the tight-knit communities of West Texas, friends and family mobilized to create a more organized search effort. They established a Facebook page called Help Find Brandon Lawson, which would eventually grow to include over 29,000 followers, testament to the widespread interest in the case and the dedication of those who refused to give up hope. The page became a central hub for sharing information, coordinating search efforts, and keeping Brandon's story alive in the public consciousness. Ladessa Lofton, the woman who had argued with Brandon on the night of his disappearance, found herself at the center of a nightmare she could never have imagined. The harsh words they had exchanged, the accusations and denials that had driven Brandon from their home, now took on a terrible significance as she realized they might have been the last conversation she would ever have with the father of her children. The guilt and regret she felt were compounded by the need to care for their 4 children while simultaneously dealing with the media attention and investigation surrounding Brandon's disappearance. The question of what had really happened to Brandon Lawson on that desolate stretch of Highway 277 became an obsession for amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts across the country. The cryptic 911 call, with its references to being chased and people in the woods, suggested possibilities ranging from a drug-related encounter to a random crime of opportunity. Some theorized that Brandon's past involvement with drugs had caught up with him, while others believed he might have witnessed something he shouldn't have seen, making him a target for violence. Law enforcement agencies, including the Texas Rangers, took over the investigation as it became clear that this was not a simple case of a missing person who would return home after a few days. Brandon's bank accounts showed no activity after the night of his disappearance, and his cell phone had gone silent after that final call to Kyle. There were no pings from cell phone towers, no credit card transactions, no sightings by witnesses in other towns. It was as if Brandon Lawson had simply vanished from the earth on that August night in 2013. The years that followed were marked by false leads, psychic visions, and amateur detective work that sometimes helped and sometimes hindered the official investigation. Every few months, someone would report seeing Brandon in another state or claim to have information about what had happened to him, but none of these leads produced concrete results. The case remained open, classified as an involuntary missing person situation, though investigators found no evidence of foul play despite the mysterious circumstances surrounding his disappearance. For Kyle Lawson, the guilt of not finding his brother that night became a heavy burden that affected every aspect of his life. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, wondering what would have happened if he had searched more thoroughly, if he had told the deputy about the 911 call, if he had stayed at the scene longer. The sound of Brandon's voice saying, "I can see you, I'm right here," haunted Kyle's dreams, a tantalizing clue that seemed to offer hope while simultaneously deepening the mystery. Ledessa struggled with her own demons as the months turned into years without any word from Brandon. The children asked endless questions about where their father had gone and when he would come home, questions that became increasingly difficult to answer as time passed. She found herself caught between hope and despair, never knowing whether she should continue waiting for Brandon to walk through their door or begin the process of moving on with her life and helping their children accept that their father might never return. The community around San Angelo and Bronte rallied around Brandon's family, organizing fundraisers and search parties, distributing flyers with his photograph and description to truck stops and restaurants throughout West Texas. Local media covered the story extensively, and national true crime shows began featuring Brandon's case, bringing attention from across the country. The 911 call was played repeatedly on podcasts and television programs, with audio experts attempting to decipher the garbled portions and determine exactly what Brandon had been trying to communicate in his final moments of contact with the outside world. As the investigation continued, certain theories began to emerge about what might have happened to Brandon. Some suggested that he had died by suicide, overwhelmed by his personal problems, and the argument with Ledessa, though this theory was disputed by family members who insisted that Brandon would never have abandoned his children voluntarily. Others believed that he had encountered criminals involved in drug trafficking, a theory supported by his references to being chased and his past involvement with substance abuse. The most troubling theory was that Brandon had witnessed something criminal occurring in that remote area and had been silenced to prevent him from reporting what he had seen. The reference in his 911 call to pushing some guys over and someone chasing him to the woods suggested a confrontation of some kind, though the poor audio quality made it impossible to determine exactly what had transpired. The fact that his body was never found in the initial searches added weight to the possibility that someone had deliberately concealed his remains. Years passed with no resolution to the mystery, though Brandon's family never stopped searching for answers. Private investigators were hired, psychics consulted, and new search areas explored based on tips from the public and theories developed by amateur detectives following the case online. The Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page continued to grow, becoming a community of people united by their determination to solve the puzzle of what had happened on Highway 277 in the early morning hours of August 9, 2013. The breakthrough that Brandon's family had been praying for finally came on a cold February day in 2022, nearly 9 years after his disappearance. A search party that included both volunteers and family members was conducting yet another sweep of the area near where Brandon's truck had been found when they discovered clothing that appeared to match what Brandon had been wearing on the night he vanished. The items were found in a remote area not far from Highway 277, partially buried and weathered by years of exposure to the harsh Texas climate. The discovery of the clothing prompted the Texas Rangers to conduct a more thorough search of the immediate area, using specialized equipment and trained personnel to comb through every inch of the terrain. On February 4, 2022, their efforts were rewarded when they uncovered human remains buried in the same general vicinity as the clothing. The location was on private property used for hunting, an area that had been searched before, but not with the same intensity and professional equipment that the Rangers brought to bear. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the state laboratory for analysis, beginning a process that would take nearly 3 more years to complete. The condition of the bones and the length of time they had been exposed to the elements made identification challenging, requiring extensive DNA testing and comparison with genetic samples provided by Brandon's family. During this agonizing wait, the family clung to hope while simultaneously preparing themselves for the confirmation they both wanted and dreaded. The official confirmation finally came on December 25, 2024, Christmas Day, when the Texas Ranger in charge of Brandon's case called with the news that the family had been waiting over 11 years to hear. The DNA testing had conclusively identified the remains as those of Brandon Mason Lawson, finally providing the answer to the question that had haunted his loved ones for so long. The call came to Ledessa, who had been designated as the primary contact for the investigation, and she immediately shared the news with the rest of Brandon's family and the thousands of people who had been following his case. The confirmation of Brandon's death brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to those who had loved him. While they finally knew what had happened to him in the most basic sense, many questions about the circumstances of his death remained unanswered. The cause of death could not be determined due to the condition of the remains and the length of time that had passed since his disappearance. Whether he had died from exposure, injury, or violence would likely never be known with certainty. The location where Brandon's remains were found provided some clues about his final hours, though it raised as many questions as it answered. He had apparently traveled some distance from his abandoned truck, moving through difficult terrain in the darkness while apparently injured and bleeding, as he had told Kyle during their final phone conversation. The fact that he had made it as far as he did suggested determination and desperation, a man fighting to survive, despite whatever had befallen him on that lonely stretch of highway. For Kyle Lawson, the confirmation of his brother's death brought a complex mix of emotions. The guilt he had carried for over 11 years about not finding Brandon that night was somewhat eased by the knowledge that his brother had not been at the truck when Kyle had searched for him. Brandon had already begun his final journey into the darkness, moving away from the road and toward the place where his remains would eventually be discovered. Kyle's decision to leave the scene that night had not altered the ultimate outcome, though the weight of wondering what if would probably never completely leave him. Ledessa faced the difficult task of explaining to their children, now teenagers, that their father's body had finally been found and that the questions about his fate had been answered, at least partially. The children had grown up in the shadow of their father's disappearance, never knowing whether he had abandoned them voluntarily or had been prevented from returning by circumstances beyond his control. The confirmation that he had died shortly after leaving their home that night provided a definitive answer to at least one of their questions. The Brandon Lawson case officially closed as a solved missing person case, though the full story of what happened to him during his final hours will likely never be completely understood. The 911 call that had captivated so many people for over a decade could finally be put into context as the desperate plea of a man who was lost, injured, and possibly being pursued by unknown individuals. Whether those pursuers were real or a product of Brandon's distressed mental state remained a matter of speculation. On August 30th, 2025, more than 12 years after Brandon Lawson disappeared on Highway 277, his family finally held the memorial service they had been planning since 2013. The ceremony took place in Burleson, Texas, attended by hundreds of people who had never met Brandon but had followed his story and been moved by his family's determination to bring him home. The service celebrated Brandon's life as a father, brother, and son, while acknowledging the mystery and tragedy that had defined his final chapter. The case of Brandon Lawson serves as a reminder of how quickly a life can change direction, how a moment of anger or poor judgment can have consequences that extend far beyond anything that could have been imagined. It also demonstrates the power of persistence and love, as shown by a family that refused to give up searching for answers despite years of disappointment and false leads. The thousands of strangers who joined their cause, sharing their story and contributing to search efforts, proved that the bonds of human compassion can extend across great distances and touch the lives of people we have never met. Today, travelers on Highway 277 pass by the spot where Brandon's truck was found without knowing the story that unfolded there on that August night in 2013. The road looks much the same as it did then, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the endless expanse of West Texas, connecting small towns and carrying people toward destinations they may never reach. But for those who knew Brandon Lawson and those who have followed his story, that stretch of highway will always be marked by the memory of a young father who set out to reconcile with his family and instead became lost in the darkness, leaving behind only questions and the echo of his voice calling out for help one last time. Brandon's remains have been returned to his family, allowing them to finally lay him to rest and begin the process of healing that had been impossible while his fate remained unknown. The memorial service marked not just the end of Brandon's story, but the beginning of a new chapter for those who loved him. A chance to remember him not as a missing person or a mystery to be solved, but as the man he had been in life, imperfect but loving, struggling but determined, and ultimately worthy of the years of searching and the thousands of prayers offered on his behalf by people who had never known him but refused to let him be forgotten.